My name's Susie. Oh, hello. My name is Susie Fish, and I'm a partner at Boltway Tennant in the UK and a patent attorney, and a co-lead of the Women in IP group of IP Inclusive. I'd like to welcome you today. This event has been a long time in the planning. Back in early 2020, a Women in IP member, Charlotte Sunderland, attended a Chicago Women in IP event called ChiWIP, and there she met Nikki Little of Fitch-Even. Charlotte put Nikki in touch with the co-leads of Women in IP, so that's me and Joanna Conway of Deloitte, who's also on this Zoom somewhere, with the idea of a cross-Atlantic collaboration. Initially, we were hoping to do the event back in mid-2020, but then COVID hit. Lots of other things got in the way as well. But we think that it's now come to fruition at just the right time. And why do we think that? Well, everyone's very used to virtual webinars and panels these days. Here we are with a truly international audience and an international panel, due in no small part to the technology that's kept us functioning and able to communicate throughout the last 15 months or so. Many of us are looking at what the new normal will be in the world of work, and in particular, what impact that's going to have on diversity, equality, and inclusion in our workplaces. We're seeing increased interest across the board from clients, from employees and leaders in making these workplaces more diverse and inclusive. So it's really exciting to be talking together to see what we can learn from one another and how we can best support each other going forwards. Just a couple of bits of housekeeping. This is being recorded, so if you would prefer not to be on video, please just switch your videos off. You will be kept on mute, and if you could stay on mute, that would be great. Any questions, please pop in through the chat, and then we can pick those up. And now I'd just like to introduce you to our panel. So we have Andrea Brewster, who's going to be chairing the panel today. We've got Chastity Boyce, Claudia Brindwoody, Natalia Maralunda, and Claire Cornell. But rather than me introduce the panel, I'm going to hand over to Andrea to introduce each of the panel in turn so that they can provide a little bit about themselves and also their areas of particular interest. And I'm hoping that Andrea is going to start with herself. So that's enough from me. So over to you, Andrea. And I'm really looking forward to this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susie, and I am looking forward to it very much as well. So I'm Andrea Brewster, and I'm the founder and now the lead executive officer of IP Inclusive, which means basically I do all the bulldozing. IP Inclusive is an initiative that aims to improve diversity, equality and inclusion, and increasingly as well, mental well-being throughout the UK's IP professions. And one really important aspect of IP Inclusive is that it is basically founded on collaboration. So lots of different types of IP professionals, all pooling their ideas and experiences, all sharing and all learning from one another. And so I am particularly excited today to have the chance to talk to our panelists here and share a few ideas about what they've seen working for diversity and inclusion. Some things will not work as well on both sides of the Atlantic, but I'm sure a lot of them will, and we can learn from what's worked and not worked and from one another's own expertise. So it's wonderful to have you all here. I'm really looking forward to having a chat, and let's start with you, Claire, because you are on the top left of my screen at the moment. This is completely random. So Claire Cornell from Finnegan, perhaps you can say a little bit about who you are and what you bring to the diversity thing. I need to say, first of all, folks, if some of us here from the UK start talking about D&I, we mean diversity and inclusion. I think on the other side of the Atlantic, you tend to use DEI, diversity, equality and inclusion. There are all sorts of acronyms, so please bear with us if we don't all sing from the same page. Claire, over to you.
Hi everybody, I'm Claire Cornell. I'm a partner at Finnegan Europe based in London. I'm sure many of the US attendees here will have heard of Finnegan because it's a fairly large player on the IP circuit in the US. and has been established in Europe for just about 10 years now. I joined Finnegan 5 years ago to really build a trademark practice. Prior to joining Finnegan, was a partner in a small UK firm where I started as a trainee back in 1997 and stayed for 19 years. We thought it would be interesting to discuss some of the differences in the approach to diversity and inclusion that I've seen between a UK practice and a US practice. But I would certainly caveat that I was really in a very small UK practice where I think we peaked at about 20 odd staff. So as well as it being a US versus UK situation, I think it's also a situation where budget has certainly made a difference with the resources that have been made available to me. What I would say also is that, I'm joining the profession in 1997, that was 24 years ago, and I'm not quite sure how we managed to get quite that far. And things have undoubtedly changed since then. I think one of the things that I've really noticed from working at Finnegan is that the diversity and inclusion is such a big part of who we are and how the firm operates. And I've been able to benefit from a lot of specific training programs through our Women's Business Initiative and Finnegan Forward, which is an outward-facing initiative which Finnegan uses to work with clients to discuss many issues relating to diversity and inclusion. That doesn't just include women's issues, but we have all sorts of other diversity programs as well for attorneys from different minority groups, and the support that we get for that is absolutely amazing. One thing I will say is that I didn't ever feel particularly disadvantaged in a small UK firm, and I was given a lot of support, but I think in terms of sort of practical ideas for somebody who might be fairly early on in their profession, in a firm that might be smaller and doesn't have quite as much resource available to them, is to really make an effort to participate in the events that are organised by CIPA or CITMA or IP and Inclusive in order to really get yourself involved in what's going on and give you the opportunity to meet other people who you can bounce ideas off. I don't know whether people want me to talk a little bit more now or whether we can go back to questions a little bit later. I don't want to take up too much of the introductory part of the panel.
No, that's a lovely introduction, Claire, and we can sort of revisit some of those issues as we get into the discussion. In particular, I am very interested in the distinction between smaller firms and larger firms. I think in the UK here, typically our average firm size is smaller, specifically in the intellectual property space. So that will be quite an interesting one to look at as well. So Claudia, if I may move to you next, moving around my grid here, would you like to introduce yourself?
Certainly. Thank you. I'm Claudia Brand-Woody, and I'm a managing director at IBM. I recently spent 10 years in our intellectual property licensing area, where we monetize the IP of IBM to deliver about $1 billion worth of profit to IBM every year. So I was very privileged to have a lot of IP to play with there. I am an out lesbian at IBM, one of our out executives, and have been the co-chair of our LGBT plus executive task force for many years, and speak on diversity as part of my night job for IBM. But I'm privileged to be in a corporate environment where diversity is part of our DNA. Our diversity roadmap goes back into the early 1900s, where our first person with disability was 1914, equal pay for equal work in 1935. Our first non-discrimination policy was in 1954. And we've done things along the way like refusing to go to North Carolina and Kentucky to build manufacturing plants until they changed the laws of those states to not separate blacks and whites in toilets and drinking fountains. Our first non-discrimination for sexual orientation was in 1984. That being said, you know, even today in a global world, we are still having to deal with diversity in many areas. And part of what we're focusing on is intersectionality now. So the diversity of being a woman, being a person of color, being a lesbian, being, you know, having different cultural backgrounds. These things matter, and we're learning more from our employees about the layers of discrimination, the layers of diversity. So I think that's a really important part of our discussion as well.
Thank you, Claudia. That's going to be a lot of relevant experience to draw on, and particularly we can hear from what a large corporation is able to do when it has that much influence and resources at its disposal, leading the way for the rest of us. Natalia, may I move over to you and ask you to tell us where you're from and what you do?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Natalia Marulanda. I am the Mansfield Role and Knowledge Sharing Manager at Diversity Lab. A bit of my background, I have no background in IP, but I did practice law for several years and decided that I wanted to do something slightly different with my career. And I really became interested in these issues because my first job out of practicing was working at a large corporation where my clients were all large law firms for the most part. And every time I had to step into a meeting with decision makers, they were always white men. And no one in that room ever looked like me. And then I started looking at my own company and seeing that in my own management structure there, things were kind of the same. And so I started to become really interested in these issues, really digging into the data, which was eye-opening at the time. I always knew the profession was not super diverse, but when you actually look at the numbers, it's pretty startling. So that's when I decided to change directions once again, and I began focusing on diversity and inclusion full time. This was about 6 or 7 years ago, and I have been at Diversity Lab for the last 2.5 years. And for those of you who may not be as familiar with our company, we are a small company, but we are fully focused on developing innovative solutions to help law firms and legal departments boost their diversity and inclusion efforts. We work with well over 150 law firms and legal departments across the United States and Canada, and soon in the UK. We're launching our Mansfield Rule initiative just next month in the UK, which we're very excited about, and it's our first international expansion. But essentially, we use data, behavioral science, design thinking, research to try new things. We're all about experimentation and piloting and iterating as we go. And so we've had a lot of really great initiatives that have come out of that style. One of them being the Mansfield Role, which is the program that I have been co-leading for the last 2.5 years. So I know we're going to talk a little bit more about the details of the Mansfield Role, but that's just a little of my background. And I'm so excited to be here and looking forward to this great conversation.
That's a great taster, Natalia, thank you. And as I understand it, the Mansfield Rule is very much based on that spirit of collaboration and sharing data and experiences and best practices. So that's very interesting to us here in the UK as well. Chastity, may I move over to you, last but not least at all? And I'm really glad you can make it. You said you were sort of back-to-back meetings right up to today. Tell us a little bit about what you do in the D&I space.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. So my name is Chastity Boyce, and my day job, I'm Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at Barings, which is a global asset management firm with our largest number of assets actually sitting in the United States and in the UK. And I love that work. I came to this work doing diversity, equity, and inclusion in asset management in a roundabout way that seems to make sense to me. So I am a recovering attorney. I was a litigator, and I practiced for over 7 years in Chicago at boutique and a small litigation firm, a mid-sized firm as well, and then had a stint in state government as well, where I was leading legal from a child welfare, education, and public safety standpoint. So an opportunity to do the work that touched really vulnerable populations across the state of Illinois and help the state figure out how we were going to litigate and work through some of our kind of large class action and consent decrees that we were a part of to make sure that we were still providing resources to the citizens of Illinois. And in the midst of doing that work, I had some other things happening on the side related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Some of that just being coming up as a Black woman in the legal field in the Chicagoland area and working with minority bar associations and leading a minority bar association, which gave me the opportunity to work with other diverse populations here in Illinois to get a better understanding of what some of the various issues were that faced different populations, and how we were working to progress in the legal field, right? And be successful, regardless if that's because you want to be partner at the law firm, you ultimately want to be a GC, or you have some other definition of success, and recognizing that oftentimes those coveted positions, those opportunities, the good work and different things actually it was easier translated to white men, right? And so really working through those issues inside my own organizations. I'm doing consulting for a little bit with other small firms, including some IP firms. And then my friend and I, Tiffany Harper, co-founded the Diverse Attorney Pipeline Program, which is a nonprofit for first-year women of color law students to help them be successful in law school and then help them find paid internship positions after they finish their first year. Because what we all know to be true, at least how the legal field works in the United States, is that you're more marketable on that 2L market, right? Where you're going to work and hopefully find your job that you're going to at least start your legal career in if you've had tangible legal experience after your first summer and your first year of school. So we founded DAP to do that work. And so in conjunction with having DAP and doing practice, I started to say a lot of things about what organizations should do differently, right? How they should retain, develop, promote and recruit diverse talent. And it got to the point that I was writing about it. I was teaching a course here in Chicago at a law school about it. And I was traveling across the country to talk about it. But I felt like I should put my money where my mouth is, right? And start doing this work full time. And so I started doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work here at a law firm in Chicago, and then got recruited to build the global DE&I function and team at a real estate investment management firm, which then led me to Bearing. So I've traversed, interestingly, through my career, but it's given me an opportunity to do DE&I work at different stakeholders, right? As a person who was actually conceiving the work and trying to advance through an organization, as a person who was responsible for the initiatives themselves and developing them and making sure that we were supporting the individuals, but also the organizations and bringing them along on their journey. And so it has become a huge passion of mine, so much so that right now I have this nonprofit and we do this work full-time year round and have 4 different national programs that we run to help men ease the gap, right? Or bridge the gap between diverse women who are trying to figure out how to be lawyers and giving them access to legal careers and coveted positions that they might not otherwise have access to because they don't understand the formulas of being successful in law school, right? Or they don't have the network to get the jobs or to get inside of the door, and they're just trying to figure out how to navigate. And they don't know how to go to office hours or write for legal exams, the different things that if you grow up in a family where maybe there are a lot of lawyers, right? Or you have someone to help guide you, the path seems a little bit easier for you. So that is me in a nutshell. I do a lot of DE&I work full time and on the side, but it truly is my life's work and passion. And I am honored to be a part of the panel today.
Thank you, Chastity. It's an inspiring story. And I mean, it's lovely to see everybody's enthusiasm for this topic. And no doubt we'll be able to revisit that in more detail as we go through. I'm particularly interested in the work that you're doing there for accessibility for particular groups, the women of colour. Here in the UK, IP Inclusive has one wing which is devoted to trying to widen the pipeline, because there's only so much you can do within the profession to improve diversity if you're not also diversifying the talent pool that you recruit from. So we have what we call Careers in Ideas, and part of its work is just to make more people aware that there are careers in intellectual property. so that we're not just recruiting from the same old white middle class backgrounds who've already got relatives and friends in the field. But because we have so few resources, we try and partner with charities who are already working in the sort of careers and outreach sectors. And we try and form partnerships with them to boost the good work they're already doing to try and help disadvantaged children into more meaningful careers. So maybe later we can hear a little bit more about the DAP scheme as well. I want to ask each of our panelists now, we've got two really big questions that we'd like to tackle, and we'll no doubt sort of pick out little details along the way as well. But the first big question is to ask people what one or two things you've seen make the biggest impact in terms of moving the dial forward, if you like. And conversely, are there one or two things which you had expected to work but maybe didn't as well as you'd hoped, or didn't work in quite the way that you'd hoped? Natalia, if I can start with you, because through the Mansfield Rule, Diversity Lab has introduced a very, very structured and systemic kind of approach to diversity. Can you tell us about the things you've identified along that journey that have really, that have had the biggest impact?
Sure. So just as a brief background about the Mansfield Rule, this was an idea that came from a Women in Law hackathon that Diversity Lab organized in collaboration with Stanford Law School. And we brought together teams of law firm partners, law students, legal department leaders, and diversity and inclusion experts to work on teams and come up with ideas. And this idea came from the NFL, the National Football League's Rooney Rule, which at the time required teams to interview at least one underrepresented candidate for open head coach and open management positions. So the idea was taken and then supersized and supercharged, and we structured it so that rather than requiring law firm, well, first of all, I should say what the goal is. So the goal is to diversify leadership and the pipeline to leadership in law firms. And it's very targeted to that specific goal. And we know there's lots of challenges, everything from recruitment and retention, but this is really focused just on this leadership pipeline. And the idea was that rather than just having one candidate, you would consider a candidate pool that's made up of at least 30% underrepresented lawyers for significant leadership roles, leadership and governance roles in the firms, for senior level lateral hiring, for equity partner promotions, and for participation in client pitch meetings. And the idea is that by having this 30%, you are breaking through some of the tokenism dynamics that can happen when you just have the one, and you are actually able to interrupt biases in more effectively. The research shows that when you have a broader list and a broader group, you are much more likely to make the hire of the underrepresented lawyer or make that selection or appointment. So firms are required, in order to be Mansfield certified, they have to meet that 30% consideration threshold in a variety of categories. But also they're required to, in that spirit of collaboration and knowledge sharing, they are required to contribute to knowledge sharing over the course of the year. And how that typically works is we host monthly knowledge sharing calls. Every month we touch on a different topic that's usually related to a Mansfield category, but is often just a diversity, equity, inclusion challenge for law firms. And the value of this is just incredible because you have, for this round, we have 118 firms that are participating. To have 118 firms that you can ask questions of, bounce ideas off of, just share, here's what we tried, here's what didn't work, here's how we got buy-in. I mean, it's just incredible, the sharing that happens and the learning that happens and the collective problem solving. It's truly a unique aspect of being a Mansfield firm. And one of the things that we think really makes a difference and makes it unique from other initiatives. And firms are also required to complete check-ins with us. And one of those check-ins, they check in 3 times a year, but two of them, I should say, actually have data collection involved in them, which is really important. And the backbone of the Mansfield rule, and part of what I think has made it so effective, is that it forces firms to establish tracking and documentation norms. And this is not something that gets talked about all the time because it's not that exciting, but we know that what gets measured gets managed. And many of the firms, the vast majority of the firms, when they join Mansfield, have not been tracking the diversity of their candidate pools. They haven't been tracking the diversity of their pipelines. And so it's really difficult to move the needle if you don't even know what your baseline is, if you don't know what problems you're trying to solve for. So Mansfield gives them that framework to really be able to be far more strategic. It gives them the outside accountability of having that certification, you know, having this outside organization that's going to ultimately certify you. And it has that collaborative element of being able to work with all of these other firms in order to achieve your goals. So I think all of those different things, you know, we always say this is not a check the box initiative where you just hand in a form at the end of the year, tell us what your demographics are, and that's it. It's a really much more involved, rigorous process. And I think that has really helped to make it effective. And we, as I said, we've collected data and outcomes. And some of this, I don't want to give too many numbers because that's not, again, not that exciting. But I just want to say we did recently do some data analysis around outcomes for early adopter firms. And so we have 2 complete years of really robust data where we were able to find that firms that have participated in this have been able to diversify specifically the racial and ethnic diversity, for example, their management committees at 30 times the rate of firms that are not participating in the Mansfield rule, which is pretty significant. And they've also been able to increase the rate of the racial and ethnic diversity of their equity partner promotions at a statistically significant rate. And even, you know, for women entering into a lot of these leadership and governance roles and their promotions, they are far outpacing their rates prior to joining Mansfield. So we can see that the data is showing us that all of these different elements are helping firms actually make significant and meaningful progress, which is very exciting.
Yeah. And it is exciting. I mean, you say the numbers aren't exciting, but believe me, it's worth visiting the Diversity Lab website and having a look at some of the statistics around the outcomes from those first few years, because they clearly, you are making a big difference. Natalia, if I can stick with you and just ask you briefly, is there one thing that you would say would prove the biggest challenge out of all the pushbacks you got and all the barriers you had to overcome? Was there one thing that particularly caused you problems as you tried to roll this out?
You know, I don't think so. I think one of the interesting was because this was born out of a hackathon where we already had partners, law firm partners that were involved and were part of the development of this. I think they were already sort of bought in terms of, at least at the beginning. And so it kind of helped the adoption of, you know, firms that were willing to try something new and different. And because the numbers haven't moved, I think people were sort of ready for something that was just, let's try it and see how it goes. And then as it continued to grow and as we were able to show that, well, even just not even from just the numbers, which I think is impressive and is important, but we also collect data on other cultural changes that firms have experienced as a result of adopting Mansfield. And there were some pretty significant changes there as well in terms of formalizing conversations and just creating an overall more inclusive work culture. So I would say some of the challenges that firms come across, I mean, honestly, a lot of it just comes from being able to communicate this to everyone at the firm. It is a change. I mean, a lot of these processes are very informal. You know, you just kind of have a short list of people and you're talking about it pretty informally. So it does represent a pretty big difference to have someone that's actually tracking and measuring and holding you accountable. When we're talking about like pitch activity, for example, so much of that happens informally. It happens on a golf course or over dinner. And so creating these formal channels where people are actually, you know, measuring, that's different. So just building those structures and, you know, that takes time, but again, it's a collaborative process and they have the resources from us at Diversity Lab as a staff, but at the other firms as well. So it can be a big lift, but it's possible. And we now have, for our newest iteration, which is launching in July, we're going to have over 160 firms, and we started with about 30 something. So it's really a testament to the achievability of it.
Brilliant progress. And we'll come back later on to ask you about the UK rollout as well, because I know a lot of people will want to hear about that. Chastity, if I can come to you now. So Natalia's work with the Mansfield Rule is very much focused on the sort of the leadership positions and the pipeline to leadership. Have you found particular things work well or don't work so well when it comes to sort of bringing new people into the professions?
Yeah, I mean, two things. I think the recruitment piece of it is the easy table stakes, right? When we think about people who are entering the profession, I think there is a wealth of diverse talent in general, right? And so if you are out there looking for a job and connected to the right networks, getting that talent in seems to be the easy piece. What the things that I haven't seen, or the things that I've seen not work well once that talent is in the door, is having cultures, right, that are actually inclusive and ready to support that diverse talent. So some of that is the work, right, that Natalia and Diversity Lab is doing and helping firms really change their processes and their systems such that when a diverse candidate comes into the door, they can look up and actually see someone who looks like them. They can envision themselves being at that place for a long time. Because I'll speak for myself and not all diverse populations, but when I come into an organization, if I look up and I don't see anyone who looks like me, right? And that could be a wealth of different things, because no one person is a monolith and they bring a lot of different backgrounds into the workplace. But if I don't see someone that I identify with, I'm like, oh, I'm not going to make it here, right? The culture, right, might not be one that I can be successful inside of the place. And so organizations really learning how to appreciate that talent and build spaces where folks can show up, be authentic, be themselves, have candid conversations around feedback, right? And critique and reviews and access to opportunity. Those are the places that I think we feel that talent getting in the door. But one thing, at least we in DAP have seen specific to IP law, and our program is US based, so I can talk about, right, what the requirements look like to get into the profession there, is we meet so many law students who tell us they want to do IP work or they want to do trademark work, but they don't have the hard science background that so often is required to get into the profession, right? And so that's the place where we see students really trying to innovate and ideate to get past that barrier. And I don't know, right, that the field is as forgiving to allow for that, right? There are some spaces where we've seen people do that soft IP work, so they've been able to get in without that hard science background. But that has been a true barrier for a lot of the diverse talent, because they're not getting the advanced science degrees that are oftentimes necessary to practice IP work. And I use the term necessary based on my understanding of what it takes to get in and not necessarily what it takes to execute the work. So I think one place that for the IP industry specifically, if there's a way to figure out how we can be creative with folks getting in. And I know there are a lot of law schools now that have, IP certificates and certifications. I know that there's a campaign of some sort with the patent bar and trying to change some of the requirements. But I think if it's even possible, right, to do that work, that there may be a better access point for diverse talent in the industry.
That's a really good point, because that access can be restricted in all sorts of arbitrary ways. And we've often found in the UK that we don't get women in because often they're put off from taking the science and technology degrees that are effectively then closing doors for them. Claire, I understand Finnegan have been doing a little bit of work around access to the patent profession, or something related to improving access generally. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
I believe that Finnegan has been looking at how diversity can be increased by dealing with the access to the patent bar. I'm afraid I haven't got any specific details on that point. I know that we've been very involved in participating in the Mansfield rules, and that's made a lot of difference in terms of the structure that we have internally. I'd say, speaking to some of Natalia's points, that specifically having that structure in place is something that's worked really well for us, because I guess we're all busy attorneys, and keeping these requirements front of mind is something that we often need to keep us focused on what we need to be doing. And I can see that is happening. That happens and works really well. In terms of how you can deal with this if you're in a smaller firm, I'm sure that this is going to be actually quite a lot more difficult to deal with, but looking for somebody who can really pioneer to make those structural changes and keep diversity front of mind is definitely something that I think would be very valuable in a firm that doesn't necessarily have the resources that we would have available to us at Finnegan. One of the second points that I was going to raise in terms of positive steps that have worked for me, and I think would work for people in other smaller firms, is really to look at knowledge sharing as well, particularly when we attend events like this. It gives us some background in terms of what other people are doing, and it can give you the confidence to have some tangible examples of what other people are doing, and that that we can bring those opinions to the mind of others who might not necessarily be so open to changes, in order to really move things forward.
Yeah, it is incredibly powerful to be able to share ideas, and I like the point you make there about taking what you hear in forums like this back to the people in your organization who are perhaps not on board yet, or perhaps don't know how to start, and saying, look, this is something tangible we can do and it's been shown to work. Claudia, if I can turn to you, over your career, what have you found brings the most impact in the DEI space?
So I agree with Natalia that we do what we measure. And so if you guys in the Mansfield rule are not including LGBT plus, then we're missing something, because we're not visible necessarily, right? You can't just say, oh, well, that's a lesbian. You can see that I'm a woman. You could see that, Chastity is a person of color. You can see lots of things about people, a person with different abilities, but you can't see your LGBT plus folks. And so firms, corporations that have self-identification, that have the ability to indicate to their employees that being LGBT plus is, everybody's welcome to succeed there, right? So, and we're the hardest population really for most folks to deal with and wrap their heads around. So making sure we're doing what we measure and including LGBT plus in slates, even if the answer is we don't have any yet. If you're asking the question, somebody in the firm may surprise you and raise their hand and say, oh yeah, but I am, right? And so the things that work there are, the allies that come into place, right? And represent us at the table when we're not there ourselves, right? And teaching people how to be allies with reverse mentoring, which is how we teach white middle-aged men about diversity many times. And the women's community did that at IBM years ago to become a reverse mentor, to tell these men what it meant to be a woman in that corporation, right? And so the men became not only allies, but sponsors. And moving from allyship to sponsorship makes a huge difference as you look at the pipeline, as you look at moving women and people of diverse backgrounds into senior management, right? So the allyship, the sponsorship, but getting there because we're measuring things, and getting there because we're doing things like reverse mentoring, because most people have good intentions. They need a safe space sometimes to ask dumb questions or scary questions. And we use that for the LGBTQ plus community as well, in terms of that reverse mentoring opportunity.
I've heard a lot of people say that is a really powerful way of moving the debate forward. And it goes to Chastity's point as well about people being able to bring their whole selves to work. And the point you raised right at the beginning, Claudia, about intersectionality, you know, we are all a whole range of characteristics, and we need to be seen for every one of those. Okay, well, let's move on, and we can maybe revisit some of these points later as well. But the next big question that I particularly want us to consider is about women specifically, and it's about ways that we can support and help to retain women in the workplace, in law generally, but also more specifically in intellectual property, and maybe a little bit about whether that's likely to change post-COVID, if there is a post-COVID, but so comments specifically about bringing women in. And Chastity, I'm going to turn to you first because of course your work with the DAPP program. What are your thoughts on how we can support and also retain women? You've already mentioned the inclusivity point, make them feel welcome when they get in. Is there anything more that you'd like to add?
Oh gosh, I could get on a soapbox. I think there are so many pieces, right? First is representing that like there is, and I've used this word earlier in our conversation, there is no monolithic experience for women, right? In the sense of, I feel like so often the conversation around how do we support women turns to how do we support women with kids and right, get them into the organization. And I want us to remember that there's such a varied experience of what it's like to be a woman inside of an organization. There's the intersectionality of being a woman, right? And all of the various identities that go along with that, that contribute to how we show up, how we experience the workplace, how we build relationships. And so that first recognition, I think, is really important, right? So often I'm in conversations where folks say, you know, we want women to be in the workplace, so we want to look at our maternity or parental leave policy. And I'm like, that's not the only place to start, right? Like, let's do some basic things like, yes, let's have a policy that allows for women who have kids to come back to work and to be successful and balance that life adjustment and not make decisions for, you know, what work they can do, whether they can travel, whether they want certain levels of responsibility based on the proximity to which they had their children, right? That for me is like very low table stakes. I think what often happens, and I'll continue to say this inside of organizations, is people start to mentor and develop and create alignment with folks who look like them, remind them of themselves. And so you oftentimes have women who are falling out of that conversation and those opportunities for informal network and relationship development by virtue that they look different, right? And there are assumptions or presumptions made regarding their gender or their sex. And so I think oftentimes women's networks can be really powerful in setting that conversation and creating those experiences and those supports in aligning allies, as Claudia talked about, and helping women get access to and understanding how business decisions are made, right? Where power is within the organization, and getting access and in close proximity with those folks who then, once they get to know them, are sponsoring them and developing them and really advocating for them across the organization. So I think any women's strategy has to be very multifaceted to account for the fact that we are multifaceted in general, but I think there are lots of different points there that organizations can start to work to be successful.
Thank you. And yeah, so we've actually had a comment in the chat box. Moving allyship to sponsorship is so important. That is the point that both you and Claudia have very much made. And actually, one of my soapboxes comes back to something you said at the start there about, you know, this assumption that if we sort out the childcare problems, that's women sorted. Because I actually think that childcare can be a man's issue as well. You know, that there are two or more parents to each family. And we kind of need to change things for men and parenting if we're also going to help the women. And there are also women who don't have families and still want to progress and need help and sponsorship. So it's a very tangled area. And I don't like the way people tend to sort of conflate the childcare and the women's issues all the time. So that's my little soapbox. Anyway, Claudia, let's move to you then. What have you seen working at IBM to support and retain women?
Well, first of all, I'd like to add on to what you just said in terms of it's also a men's issue, whether it's, parenting. It's also a men's issue for part-time work. One of the things we saw when we enabled our men to choose to work part-time or choose to work different hours, and made it okay for the men to do that, then that opened it up for everybody in a different way. So women working part-time, or women having different work hours to accommodate their children or their elderly parents or whatever, became part of the more mainstream, right? When men were allowed and encouraged to do that. So it's a really interesting dynamic that most folks in law should know, that some of the seminal women's cases were taking on men's discrimination that then, opened up the world for women, right? So that's certainly something that I think we have to look at. But the other thing that IBM has done is have a reentry program, a different on-ramp, a later career on-ramp for our women who wanted to come back to work. Maybe they did want to stop and help their young children until they went off to school. But having that reentry point that made sense, that let their women continue to learn while they were at home with their children. And the virtual world lets us do that now in a very different way, right? Is to be intentional about that reentry, so that you don't feel like you're 5 years behind. You've kept up, they've kept in touch, they've made sure that the people were still good at what they did, right? They were still current, but being intentional about the reentry was something that gave us a rich amount of talent and a very loyal group of talent, because we enabled that.
Thanks, Claudia. I think, and then it's not just keeping up to date with the training either, is it? It's retaining the confidence, it's retaining the networks, which of course are so important when you want to progress. So re-entry scheme, yeah, that's one of the key things. Now, Claire, Finnegan, I know, have a strong tradition of supporting women and having women's support groups within the organisation. Perhaps you can tell us what you think are the best ways to support and retain your female talent.
I've found this as one of the more interesting contrasts between the US practice and maybe the UK office, because we do have to function slightly differently just because of the differences in the employment market, the differences in statutory benefits that women will get in the UK compared to those in the US. One thing that I particularly pick up on always, and to Claudia's point, is really bringing men into the conversation is really, really important too. And once you start to see men participating in flexible working patterns, you start to see the changes, I think, become more understood. I feel that in the UK, we've maybe gone a little bit more towards redefining the meaning of what success is in terms of being a successful attorney. In our US practice, I feel still that success is very bound to working full-time and working a lot of hours, whereas in our London office, we've been flexible in terms of offering flexible working patterns to people with children or people who want to be able to pursue other occupations or hobbies besides just attorney work. And I think from a personal perspective, rather than from a Finnegan perspective, I would say that having happy, healthy, and mentally engaged employees is so important that success doesn't always need to be about working every day of the week and working consistently throughout your working career, that it can be healthy and also encourage that people are given some time to pursue their family obligations or their own personal their personal interests aside of that. And I think that Finnegan in London has been really good at supporting that and enabling those sort of flexible working arrangements for our attorneys.
So that's benefited not just the women, but probably the entire workforce, and no doubt the bottom line as well, because productivity, we all know, improves if people are more comfortable. Claire's talk, Natalia, has brought us straight back to you, hasn't it? Because we're thinking now about the difference between the US and UK position, and this is an ideal opportunity to ask you about your new version of the Mansfield Rule, which is tailored for UK law firms. Now, tell us about how you've had to tailor it.
Sure. And just sort of building, there were so many great things that were shared. I just building off of that, just also the importance of leaders modeling the behaviors that they're saying are acceptable and are okay, because everyone, like I said, is kind of looking up to see what's happening. And if you can change your policy to have, equal parenting leave and flexible leave for, everyone. But again, if the leaders themselves are not modeling through their own behaviors that it's okay to do these things, there's probably not going to be all that effective. So just wanted to mention that point, but so many great points were raised there. And I also did want to mention that we do include LGBTQ+ lawyers and lawyers with disabilities in the Mansfield Rule. So that's part of the group of underrepresented lawyers that we track. So just wanted to say that. Now, in terms of the UK, how did we even get here? So we have a lot of large firms. So the Mansfield Rule has changed in so many different ways and grown over the years. And we started, the original Mansfield Rule has mostly large law firms that have at least 100 to 150 lawyers, but some of them have thousands of lawyers. As we know, they're these large global firms. And many of them said to us that they wanted to be able to take this to their UK offices and some of their other offices. We thought the UK was the most natural place to start because it is the most similar to the US in many ways. And so we, of course, wanted to pilot things in the United States for a little bit, see how that went. Obviously, we've had a great deal of success that we've talked about. So we thought we were ready to take it on in the UK. And quite frankly, the differences are not that big. The goals are all the same: establishing tracking and documentation norms, expanding mindsets about who could be a leader, boosting transparency, working together as a community. All of that is central to the Mansfield Rule UK. The real difference is that we've included some different categories, and this was based on feedback from an advisory board of firms with UK offices that let us know that there were perhaps different areas that they wanted to tackle with the Mansfield Rule. So one is that while in the US and Canada, we focus only on senior level lateral hiring, in the UK, we will also be tracking newly qualified lawyer hiring. So that's where firms identified for us, they had some pretty significant gaps that they thought could be helped by doing this tracking and measuring. And then we also included a pay equity reporting category, which we don't have in the United States, but we have included it for Certification Plus in the UK. And Certification Plus is sort of like an added layer of certification for firms that have not only met the consideration threshold and they've considered 30%, but they've actually achieved 30% representation in a range of categories. And one of those categories is to have pay equity reporting. So we initially did have some concerns or questions, I should say, from firms around GDPR and things that we don't really have to contend with in the same way in the United States. But because the rule is structured in such a way that it's really providing sort of aggregate data, there's no data transfer to us. I mean, there's ways that we've, been able to make it work so that it will work for firms in the UK without having to worry too much about some of those considerations. But we're, this, like everything we do, it's a pilot. We're going to see how it goes. We expect that we will be launching with about 12 firms, which I think is a really good size because it's just big enough to have some really robust knowledge sharing, but also small enough that we can sort of pivot where we need to and make adjustments as necessary. And then we'll take those findings and use them to help improve UK 2.0. So we'll keep all of you posted. We do keep all of our data tracking and outcomes on our website, so you can all see how it's working.
Now, you've already answered one of the two questions I was going to ask about the sort of the specific UK situation, which is the data gathering, data protection side of things. But I also wanted to ask a little bit, are our employment laws a little bit different in terms of, is some of what you're doing making people worry about positive discrimination, perhaps?
So, well, I'm not an employment lawyer. I give no legal
But they've
advice.
not raised those concerns with you then?
Yeah, we haven't really. Most of the concerns that we've heard and questions that we've heard have been around just the data collection process itself. And we always say, even here in the U.S., and the employment laws are probably different, but you just have to make a risk assessment. How much are you willing to risk in order to make progress? And it's a little bit of a calculation for everyone. We've, of course, met with lawyers who have assured us that everything falls within the confines of the law. But, it's really about firms being able to say, we're going to take this measured risk in order to see this kind of progress. And most firms are willing to do that. So thankfully.
Brilliant. I often think, and this is a somewhat cynical view, that positive discrimination is a rather subjective thing, because the very people who say, oh, we can't possibly do that, are the ones who were always positively discriminating, but in the other direction. And just all we're trying to do is level the playing field.
Exactly. It reminds me of that quote, when you're used to privilege, equity feels like oppression. Right? The idea that once we're trying to do something that's equitable and make sure that all populations have access to resources and to develop, when you're used to a system that's so skewed towards, favoritism for your population, it feels like you're being wronged or discriminated against in some way.
That is a very, very good point, and I'm seeing a lot of nods. Just sticking with the Mansfield rule, just very briefly, Natalia, somebody has asked, in the UK, will you be starting with just big law, or is it open to smaller firms too? I mean, you've gone for the mid-size in the US, haven't you?
Yes. So to answer the question directly, we will be working with firms that have about 75 lawyers at a minimum. And the reason why we have that sort of baseline is because in order for the rule to really operate as intended, you do need to have some pretty substantial volume of hiring. You have to have certain organizational structure, leadership structures in place. There have to be some regular turnover. Otherwise, it doesn't really work. So it really only works for firms of a certain size. Now, in the United States, what was happening was after about 2-3 years, where we had said you have to have at least about 100, and we had some that were slightly under, but it was challenging for them to meet the requirements. And especially kind of talking about some of the differences in resources, those smaller firms often don't have a DE&I staff that is going to be taking on, the administrative lift of a lot of these initiatives. So everything is, attorney driven, and they didn't necessarily have the resources to make it happen. And so what we were able to do, and we always felt badly from when smaller firms came and said, oh, we'd love to do this. And we'd say, oh, but you have to have at least 100 firms. That never feels good. And so what we were able to do was to tweak things a bit for the mid-sized Mansfield firm, which just launched last year. And there's 25 firms currently participating in that, more or less, but we are launching a second cohort in September. And I think we have like 50 that have already signed up. But essentially, we just sort of tweaked the requirements a bit to really right-size it for leaner population structures and leaner firm populations and leadership structures, and just sort of make it more attainable. It's a longer certification period, so it's 18 months rather than 12 months. They have fewer categories. So I don't know if that's in the cards for the UK. Perhaps we'll, of course, start to see, as I said, where this first pilot goes and what we learn, and then we can use it to build. Because I know, as you mentioned, there are a lot of smaller firms in the UK, and we'd love to be able to work with all firms of all kinds. So once we get our lessons learned from a couple of rounds of original UK Mansfield, we'll see how we can extend that out to other firms and perhaps even other countries.
Well, stay in touch with IP Inclusive. If we can help provide input into that process, we certainly will.
Thank you.
So we've sort of tackled the two big questions, and we've got some time for Q&A. So please do, everybody, send in your questions through the chat box, and I will try to pick up as many of them as I can. We've had a really good question here. I'm going to read it out. I think many of the current generation of managers think that they understand diversity and inclusion issues and consider themselves as being very supportive. But in reality, there's often a large gap between perception and reality. So how do you approach the majority individuals, the ones who are not from underrepresented groups, and make them realise that they need to work on their diversity and inclusion understanding? And how do you encourage them to become informed and vocal allies or champions? Claire, can I start with you? Sorry to sort of land you with this, but the gap between perception and reality in terms of the people who say that they get diversity, have you noticed that? Have you noticed it when you moved between firms at all?
I would say yes. From coming from a more traditional UK firm background, I would say that there are a lot of people who do feel that they have very good intentions, but maybe don't have their eyes open necessarily to everything that's going on around them. And I have certainly found that being somewhere where there's more awareness of diversity and inclusion issues, and there's more time spent talking about those, that it becomes clearer to the people who count that there are voices that are maybe speaking quite loudly who haven't been heard, and just to have those groups of people, I guess, working together. I know it's not always easy if you're in a small firm particularly, but I think maybe it also goes back to, you know, this making sure that you participate in group events where you can get some tangible examples from other firms, so that you've really got something to go back to the management structure with and say, well, you know, these are issues that we face. I don't know how helpful that is as an example, but I think, you know, in terms of where I've seen sticking points, having other information to back up the ideas that you have, and talking freely and openly as often as you can about those issues with people so they become familiar with them is probably the best advice I could give.
Mm. And Claudia, if I can bring you in there, because you mentioned reverse mentoring before, presumably for you, that is one of the most powerful ways to tackle this issue, is it?
Well, it's one of the ways. One of the most powerful and light bulb kind of moments for straight, white, middle-aged men, right, to learn about diversity for me is to talk to them about a sports team and ask them what their favorite sports team is. And if they're in the US, they're going to say football, and they mean American football, basketball or baseball. If they're in the UK, they're going to say football, and they mean proper football, which we in the US call soccer, right? And the next thing I do is say, okay, who's the most important player? Because that's what they identify with, right? Quarterback for American football, pitcher for baseball, you know, either point guard or center for basketball, and they'll say striker for proper football, right? And I say, okay, I'll give you a team of all quarterbacks or all pitchers or all whatever, that one thing, all alike. And I'm going to take the diverse team that has offense, defense, all the different positions, all the different skill sets. And we're going to play each other. Which of us is going to win? And the light bulb goes on, because they understand that moment that I'm going to win, and I'm going to win every time, right? So making diversity real for them sometimes is using those kinds of metaphors that are very, you know, insightful for them. The other thing we do is, and we've taken all of us out of our comfort zone sometimes when we're trying to educate folks on trans issues, on non-binary issues, on how to use pronouns, right? So bringing our younger generation in to those discussions is really very important, to have those roundtables, those listening roundtables where people can hear from our younger generation what is top of mind, what is something that is meaningful for them. So those are just two thoughts.
That's an incredibly, that's a brilliant metaphor, that the sporting one. I think everybody's been writing that down. And I think, you know, what that goes to the bottom of is, it's not enough just to be supportive of one or two people who are different. It's actually wanting to encourage difference, wanting to recruit for difference, recognizing that difference is actually what's going to make us stronger. And you talking about trans issues and things there, it's something I found personally works quite well. It is when you've got that personal story, and yes, you're bringing in the next generation and things, but my eldest daughter is transgender. And I find when I'm talking to people, and often they're making the, well, you know, totally inappropriate comments and, you know, bits of banter and things that they think nothing of, which are actually quite offensive. But if you stop them in their tracks and say, I have a transgender daughter, and you start talking about your transgender daughter, it suddenly becomes an individual person. There's a link, they can relate, and it does make people stop. It does, you know, it's easy to be offensive in the generic, but it's not so easy when you're being specific. And I think those sort of individual case studies can really help there.
Well, that's very powerful, because, you know, 80% of people have somebody in their life, a friend, a neighbor, you know, a daughter that is LGBT plus. And if we assume our clients are straight, we're going to be wrong 5 to 10% of the time. You know, and I've had some really powerful, interesting conversations in the client space. So you're absolutely right. That's incredibly powerful to bring, you know, your stories in, to make it real, to make it personal, and people then open themselves up to learning.
Yeah. And I think we need role models, not just amongst the underrepresented groups, but amongst the allies as well. You know, we need senior people to speak up about what allyship and sponsorship means to them. I have a question now that's come in for Chastity specifically. And it's actually something I've heard a lot of people asking about. If an organization's not diverse, how does it break the cycle so that when they recruit somebody diverse, they don't look around and think, you know, that I don't belong here? And we've had people saying this a lot, you know, how do I make people feel welcome when the only existing staff I can put on my website are white middle-class males? I don't want them to be, but, you know, so how do you break that cycle?
Yeah, that's a great question. And some of it dovetail into one of the responses that I would have given to the last question if there was a chance to speak on that. But the first piece is, like, organizations have to be really transparent and honest, right? I think when you're working in an organization where the population is incredibly homogeneous, you have to be honest about, we don't know how to do this correctly, right? If you look at all of us, we all have a shared experience, a shared identity, whatever that is. We want to do better, right? We want to be better. This is a place where you are welcome here, but we also need you to be really honest about what you need to be supported, right? And how this work happens. We can teach you how to be an attorney. We can teach you how to exist within our organization, but the opportunity to mentor you and to let you know that we want you to be here, we're going to have that open dialogue, which is one of the things I was going to say about how you bring folks in the majority along. Is, I think, in addition to all of the things that the panelists have shared, you have to have someone in the organization that can speak truth to power, right? Who can help them understand how decisions that they're making, just because they're making them based on whatever their day-to-day experiences and exposures and backgrounds are, right, could have been different, right, if they were thinking about it with a diversity lens, right, or if they were being intentional about being inclusive. Because while, yes, the conversations with their coworkers are helpful, and with folks who have different experiences with them, actually walking a person through how they could make different decisions if they were thinking about that from those different DEI lenses, I have found to be incredibly successful, right? When I have picked up the phone and called someone and said, hey, I saw that, you know, you're working with this person, or this diverse person had this experience with you, and then you put someone else on the case, right? Here's how this could have gone differently, and what that could have signaled to the person about how they're valued, how they're welcomed here. So I think a lot of being honest and transparent is going to be really important for organizations that don't have the level of diversity that they want, because the other piece is, like, there's a war for diverse talent, right? And there is an opportunity for diverse talent to really assess how serious organizations are about their diversity and inclusion initiatives. And I think the more that we have this conversation, the better, especially the younger generation, right? They're holding nothing back, and they want to know, you know, what you're doing, what your spin looks like, what your promotion stats look like, your spin in diverse communities, what your promotion stats look like, all of the things that at least my generation, I'm certain my parents' generation, we're taught you shouldn't be asking. And so we as organizations have to get really comfortable too with being able to talk about where we are on our diversity journey.
That's an interesting point, the honesty one. And it makes me think, Natalia, if I can bring you in here, about the sort of the benefits to companies when they do get the diversity and inclusion right in terms of being able to attract new talent. Have you found that firms that sign up to the Mansfield rule are at least partly doing so because they want to be more attractive both to new recruits and to lateral hires?
Yes. So one of the data points that we collect at the 6-month mark, and again at the end of the year, is around some of the improvements. As I think I mentioned, some of the cultural improvements and other questions that we ask. And the vast majority of them say, and one of the questions we ask them is, what are the top 3 reasons that you joined the Mansfield rule? And one of the consistently top rated answers is because they get positive feedback from recruits. And it's an important piece. And we even had, just recently, I spoke with a firm who said that they just hired a lateral partner who wasn't even considering going to a firm that wasn't Mansfield certified. And that's because that signals to the recruiter, to the candidate, that this firm is doing something very specific and is being very intentional about their diversity efforts. Now, that's just one piece of the broader diversity strategy, but it sends a very strong signal to to candidates about the kind of environment that they're going into and how seriously the firm takes these initiatives and their true commitment, not just their stated commitment. So it's definitely something that firms have in mind when they join the Mansfield role, and one of the benefits of having that certification.
Chastity, have you found that the women of color that you're working with on your Access program, are they similarly sort of looking at potential employers?
100%. They're looking at who organizations are partner with, right? Especially going back to the question of what if we're not as diverse, who they're partnering with on their journey to be more diverse. And if there aren't certain boxes, for lack of a better phrase, or certain organizations that have been kind of held out to be the authority figure, right, on how to develop, retain, promote, and include diverse populations, yes, absolutely, women of color are making that decision. Not just women of color, though. I think all diverse populations. When I think about HRC and how important HRC is to the LGBT plus community, right, if you aren't getting HRC certified, right, and that is a full scale look at like what your policies and processes look like, in addition to what your demographics look like, in addition to what your benefits look like, right? All of these various things that are so important to how diverse populations are living their lives, it's table stakes.
Sorry, just for the benefit of thickos like me, HRC is?
I apologize, Human Rights Commission. So they really focus, yeah, and they do a corporate equality index that asks you several questions about your organization and require you to take a deep dive and really look at how inclusive all of these various pockets of the organization are. And then they give you a score based on how you answer those questions and what type of policies and procedures and practices you have in play.
Okay.
It would be similar to what Stonewall does in the UK.
Okay. Mm-hmm. I was going to ask you, Claudia, about, we've talked about being more attractive to potential recruits, but what about being more attractive as outside counsel for corporations like IBM? I mean, does diversity play a part when you're hiring counsel?
Absolutely, absolutely. It plays a part not only in when we're hiring counsel, but when we do any of our procurement. We have a diversity program in procurement that for many years has included women, underrepresented minorities, LGBT plus. I mean, we had people whose role was LGBT plus certification in our procurement area. So very important to us that our providers look like us, have the same values we do. And that's not just numbers, but it goes to the values. It goes to not just diversity, but inclusion. And so we look at that next layer of what does that mean for you? is it just you've got a bunch of people at the lower level, or do you really have people at your senior executive levels that you have included in your corporate strategy and decision making, right?
Okay. So Mansfield Rule could definitely come in there, but are there any other sort of external charters or commitments or pledges that you might look out for to sort of get a feel for an organization's diversity credentials?
Well, we do our own certification, but as Chastity mentioned, HRC, we look at where corporations rank on various lists of, are they on their working mothers list, right? Or are they on the Black entrepreneurs list? Or, we've got lots of lists we look at for verification, right? And so any kind of certification associated with their own diversity gives them credibility as they're responding to our procurement requests.
Yeah. And there will be different ones in different countries.
Yeah.
I mean, over here, there is certainly a working families list. There is the Stonewall Index. Quick plug for the IP Inclusive Charter. It's only a small, very simple, self-certifying best practice charter, but it's a starting point that it shows that firms are at least thinking about diversity and inclusion. Okay. We've got two key questions. I want to finish off with one lovely question for all of you, but just before we move on to that, let's touch very, very briefly on emerging from lockdown. What do you think the implications are going to be for inclusivity? Chastity, do you have any thoughts on that?
Man, I think the implications are huge for a few reasons, right? Of course, you have people who just in general have been trying to balance life demands and have been in a situation where we've disproven, right? All of the hypotheses that we work better, that we're more profitable, all of the things when we're in person, we've shown that the world's not going to fall apart, right, if people are working from home. And so I think it's going to be more difficult for organizations to make the business case that everyone has to be in the office. But I think you also have people who are evaluating life differently than they were before, right? And a lot of times when you get in these big corporations or in certain professions, you take the idea that work is life, right? And I think people are evaluating the time that they spend at work and with their careers in comparison to whatever those other host of things that are important to them and brings them peace and happiness and joy. And it's going to be really important for organizations to show that, yes, they care about the work and the work getting done, but they're going to give people the flexibility to do those other things that they are passionate about. I think we're going to see people making choices differently in the future. And for organizations that want to win that war on talent that's being waged right now, it's going to be the organizations that have figured out how to continue to embed flexibility as a part of their culture.
Oh, that's a lovely answer. Claire, what have you noticed? Finnegan is a UK and US, well, Europe and US firm. Have you noticed a difference in approaches between your European and US colleagues when it comes to evaluating the next few years?
I think on the whole, we're looking at the business as a whole rather than separating out what we'll do in the UK and the US. And interestingly, I've participated recently in discussions with our US firm and with our colleagues and clients in London to look at how particularly women will be affected by a return to work, and things that people have really talked about that we're going to try to embrace relate to the inclusion of everybody in meetings, and that would particularly include making it possible for people to join meetings through video conferencing rather than always being present in the room. And particularly that gives advantages to more junior attorneys who might previously not have been invited to come and attend meetings, but also to parents who want to spend some more time working from home but still want to be able to participate in meetings with clients internally, and just to make sure that everybody's still part of the picture, because I do feel that there's been a lot more inclusion based on the ability to join video conference meetings, and particularly on an international basis. So I think that's one of the key the key things that we've been noticing and hoping to move forward with.
Yeah. Talking of virtual meetings, I think somebody here doesn't have their microphone on mute and there's a bit of slapping and stuff going on in the background. So could you all please check that your microphones are on mute? Personally, I'm sort of following on from what you've just said, Claire. I'm sort of a bit worried that if we move to what people are talking about as a hybrid working environment, where, you know, you have a meeting that some people join remotely and others are there live, that we have to be very, very careful to make sure that the experience is just as inclusive for both sets of people. And we have to work really hard at making sure when we allocate work within teams that we're taking account of the people who are not there in person. I think we will move to some sort of hybrid. Almost certainly different people will be in the office at different times. And let's hope we hold on to the inclusivity as we move to that new model. Somebody has actually commented here, hybrid conference calls will need to be dealt with sensitively. I've attended conference calls in the past where the woman joining remotely was essentially ignored. Well, I'll tell you what, I've joined meetings in the past where the woman in the room was essentially ignored. So I think perhaps we're making some progress there. I want to finish off by posing a quick question to each of you in turn, and I'm going to ask you to be fairly brief with your answers here. But it is this: if you have one day a week to dedicate to diversity and inclusion issues, one day a week, what's the most effective way for you to use that time? So who wants to start?
I can start only because I saw this in the chat and was giving some thought to it, thinking that you would go back to it. And my answer would be building trust. And that's because so much of this DEI work is relationship and trust-based work. People have to trust you as a DEI, personnel or authority inside of the organization, and be someone that they can go to be really vulnerable and say, hey, how do I do this work? And here's the problems that I'm having. And I found that trust has allowed me to be a thought partner when they're thinking through promotions and retention decisions and how to resolve conflicts and the very things that signal to us whether we belong inside of an organization. So that would be my answer. So I could only do one thing.
How would you use your one day a week? Would you sort of go and find people and just start conversations and see what you could find out about them?
Yep, I would spend a lot of time having conversations with people and doing a lot of listening and watching the environment and how people interact.
Which would, that would take one day a week, if not more. So that's a good answer. Who wants to go next? One day a week. Go on, Claudia, you can fill one day a week. What would you do?
Well, indeed, I can. So two things. One, I wanted to comment on your earlier thing, because in the virtual world, I think we've recognized our common humanity a whole lot more than we have in the past, whether it's having little kids get on their mother or father's lap and show their homework or whatever, or somebody's dog jumping, into the picture, or the cat walking across the keyboard. We've recognized our common humanity in a new and different way. And I think that's just brilliant. And I hope it continues. But back to the one day question. First of all, Chastity, I actually believe in one of my sayings is we move at the speed of trust. And that's true for business. That's true for diversity. It's true for inclusion. It's true for so many things and personal relationships. We move at the speed of trust. So I loved your answer. But for me, the virtual world has enabled me to do an awful lot of keynote speeches on diversity and inclusion, particularly LGBT plus, for corporations and organizations around the world, much easier. So it's Pride Month. I've done, I can't tell you, probably an average of 3 or 4 a week. But if I were doing that one day a week, I would be delighted.
So use that day to go out and be that role model. Speak out. Yeah, fantastic. Claire, how would you use your one day?
I think for me, it would be to talk and listen to the people around me, one of the things that I have noticed from the discussions that we've been having more recently is that other people do have very different opinions to those that I hold, and to take time to recognize those differences and what that means to me and what that means to them, and how I can make positive changes in order to accommodate for what other people want as well as what I need. And one thing that particularly struck me was a post I saw on LinkedIn by a white man in his 50s, and he'd effectively was trying to get people to champion the fact that he'd decided that he never needed to be in the office again, and working from home was going to be great, and he was going to be able to do just as good a job from this point forward. And a lot of people agree with that, and they like the idea of that flexibility. But I thought, you know, what if I'm the person in the office and I really need that person to be there for me sometimes? And I think it's going to be really important that we do listen to what everybody has to say and make sure we accommodate their own needs. So yeah, listening and understanding what other people need, as well as thinking for yourself, is probably going to be the most important one day for me.
Yeah, it's one of the most common assumptions or unconscious biases, if you like, isn't it? That everyone will think the same way I do. So you've all talked very powerfully about spending that day listening to other people. Natalia, would you agree with that? Do you have something else that you would like to do with your day?
So I definitely agree that talking, listening, building relationships, we move at the speed of trust. I love that. I am going to carry that forward. And I'll be sure to credit you, Claudia. I love that so much. And I think the only other thing I would add with my day is, and I wouldn't be part of the Diversity Lab team if I didn't mention doing just some number crunching, data crunching, looking, you know, I think I mentioned this before, but the data really needs to help guide the strategy. Those stories are so important, but you have to let the data tell you where to go in many cases and where you really have to concentrate your efforts. Because if you're just throwing these sort of blanket initiatives around thinking that you're going to solve these generic diversity problems, it's just not going to be that effective. And so every organization struggles with different challenges. Being able to use the data to guide you to where those real challenges are, uncover what's the real root of the issues that your organization has, and then creating the strategies that are going to address those very specific pain points. I think that also helps build trust, because when you're just kind of throwing stuff out there and it's not working, that it just gives people the sort of fuel they need to say, you see, that's just a waste of time. We don't really need that. Whereas I think when you are really strategic and targeted and you have the data to show the progress and the outcomes that you've made, it makes such a difference. It builds trust and it actually moves the needle. So I would definitely spend part of my day doing some data crunching.
That's great, because I think what you're effectively saying is, having had the conversations, having listened to people and learned about them, use that knowledge to create some positive change in the system as a whole. And I think that's a really nice way of sort of bringing everything together, because you've got 4 people here and me trying to do my little bit as well, but we, you know, all working really hard for diversity and inclusion, and I'm sure a lot of you are as well. And you've learned some great ideas here about how you might set about that. It all comes down to trust, but there's an awful lot of work that needs to be done as well to turn that trust into real, tangible change for everybody. And it's just been wonderful to hear from all of you. Thank you so much, to hear views from different types and sizes of organizations, different sides of the Atlantic. What an incredibly innovating experience this has been. So thank you all very much. And I'm going to hand back to Nikki Little, one of the co-organizers of the event, who has a few final words to say. Nikki, over to you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And I'm just going to echo what she ended with there. On behalf of ChiWIP and Women in IP and Susie and Joey, my co-planners of this, just a tremendous thank you to our panelists. I know that everyone's time is precious, and we really do appreciate you taking the time out of your day to share all this knowledge and insights with us. It was everything I expected to be it to be. So while it was a long time in the planning, it was definitely well worth the wait. So thank you all so much for attending, and hope to see you at another upcoming event.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.